Welcome to the second of 3 podcast episodes on time and range. Today, we're going to focus on time and range in pregnancy. I'm your host, Dr. Neil Skolnick, Professor of Family and Community Medicine at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University, and joining us today to share her expertise is Dr. Nicole Earhart. Dr. Earhart is an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine in the Division of Endocrinology and Nutrition at the University of Washington. Nicole, welcome.
Thank you, Neil, for having me. Just a little background about myself. I am an adult endocrinologist now at the Diabetes Institute here in Seattle with the University of Washington. And previously, I'm an old Army doctor as well. So I have that hat that I used to wear. And I've always been really passionate about diabetes and technology. So I'm really glad to be here today talking with you.
Well, this is the perfect intersection of diabetes and technology. So before we dive into CGM and pregnancy, can you just touch on the prevalence of diabetes, prediabetes, and diabetes during pregnancy?
Yeah, I think first what we have to highlight is those unfortunate new statistics that came out about diabetes in general. We're now at 38 million people in the US living with diabetes from 34 million. And so, of course, in pregnancy, the rates are rising as well. But right now we have older stats, right? Between 2000 and 2010, they saw an over 56 rise in pregnancy and existing diabetes, so type 1 and type 2. So on average, 1 to 2% of people with pregnancy have type 1 or type 2 diabetes. And then gestational diabetes, so up to 10% of people will develop gestational diabetes in pregnancy. And of course, that statistic can be even higher in certain ethnicities and people in different social economic backgrounds.
Pretty amazing. So this is something that we're going to be seeing regularly as we're taking care of people. As we dive now into specifically elevated glucose in pregnancy, why is glucose important in pregnancy? Why do we care?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So unfortunately, what we do know is there is increased maternal and neonatal risk associated with higher glucose in pregnancy. There was a recent cohort large study that showed, for example, an increase in perinatal death. So in the third trimester, when the A1C is greater than 6.5, they saw in both the type 1 and type 2 patients in pregnancy and diabetes, more perinatal death. And this was worse, of course, with higher A1Cs, but also what was concerning is that it was worse in the type 2 population.
So clearly very important. Can you go over some of the things that we can do to help support our patients who are living with diabetes during pregnancy?
Yeah, that's great. And so, as I've said, I'm a big advocate of technology for diabetes. And I do think continuous glucose monitoring is one empowerment tool for our patients in pregnancy and diabetes. So continuous glucose monitoring is a device that basically will show your glucoses in real time, or there's a scan intermittent technology where you scan it and you get to see your glucose in real time. But another important thing about the continuous glucose monitoring technology is it doesn't just show a static number, it also shows trends and directionality. And so we really believe that continuous glucose monitor is just a tool in our toolkit for our patients in pregnancy.
So that's a really good point. We're used to, a lot of us, just checking blood, finger stick blood sugars or looking at our A1C. And as you talked about, showing trends, talk about the advantages of CGM over just checking finger sticks.
Yeah, to start off, in pregnancy, we do have tighter goals when we're checking finger sticks in pregnancy, which is our traditional ways of looking at glucose in pregnancy. And we want to have a glucose less than 95 in the fasting state. And 1 hour after the meals, the goal is to be less than 140, and 2 hours after the meal, less than 120. So much tighter control than for our typical patients living with diabetes. Additionally, we think about goals via A1C. And in pregnancy, again, the A1C goal is much lower. So in preconception, we're really hoping to have an A1C of less than 6.5 and even less than 6. And then during pregnancy, the goal is less than 6. Now, if there's significant risk for hypoglycemia, we might aim for a slightly different goal, like 6.5 or even less than 7 if we individualize it to the patients. But that was our old way of thinking about glucose control in pregnancy. Now that we have continuous glucose monitoring devices, we can look a little bit more dynamically about the glucoses in pregnancy. And so, in patients living with diabetes, with our continuous glucose monitoring devices, we sort of look for that idea of time in range. And time in range is based upon a blood sugar of 70 to 180. And the goal in those patients living with diabetes is greater than 70%. Now, in pregnancy, as we said, we need tighter goals. So what we do know that in the type 1 population, we are aiming for a time in range goal of 63 to 140, 70% of the time or greater. Now, I highlight that it's just for type 1 because we have limited data in our type 2 and our gestational diabetes. And so the thought process is we might even need more time in range, like up to 90% to be successful and prevent complications during the pregnancy.
Well, Nicole, I'll ask you to talk about the evidence supporting CGM use in a minute, but it strikes me, as you mentioned, A1C goals prior to pregnancy. As a general approach, do you start addressing this issue of CGM when one of your patients with diabetes is thinking about getting pregnant so that it kind of flows in nicely and they have the opportunity to learn how to use the technology?
Yes, that's a great point. In patients with pre-existing diabetes or type 1 diabetes, we are always advocating for the use of this technology in the preconception time because it allows people to sort of learn a little bit so then they can do even better during the pregnancy. Unfortunately, it's not always accessible because continuous glucose monitoring is available in general for patients who are on multi-dose insulin. But in, let's say, pre-existing type 2 diabetes that don't need insulin until the pregnancy, it might not be an option.
That's a really good point. Can you go over, we're talking about CGM in pregnancy. Is there evidence to support its use?
Yeah. And I think the answer is we're gathering more information in the type 2 and the gestational diabetes population. We actually have an ongoing study in gestational diabetes and CGM here at the University of Washington. So hopefully more data to come on that. But in the type 1 population, there has been several larger studies, and probably the most looked at one is the concept study that was all in type 1 population. And yes, they did show potential benefit to the patients living with diabetes and their unborn babies. So I think I like to use number to treat because it's a powerful number. What they found was in the concept study with the use of continuous glucose monitoring, they found that the number you needed to treat was 6 to prevent neonatal intensive care admission and large for gestational age. And the number needed to treat was 8 for neonatal hypoglycemia. So, very, very powerful, these things that we can do to prevent the complications in that perinatal period.
Nicole, that's an amazing number needed to treat. In my world, where we take care of a lot of patients with diabetes and we look at other endpoints, things like ACE inhibitors for hypertension have numbers needed to treat of 30. Similarly, for SGLT2s, you're in that 30 range to prevent adverse cardiovascular outcomes. The number needed to treat of 6 to 7 is a blow you away sort of number. Translating the data to practice, how has it been? From a practical point of view, what's been your experience?
Great question as well. So the first thing I want to highlight is we want to empower our patients living with diabetes, right? And people are very motivated in pregnancy, even more so than just when they're living with diabetes, but it can be overwhelming, these goals. So What I also want to highlight is little changes in the time and range can affect fetal outcomes. So we do have data that show that, as little as 5% improvement in time and range will improve the benefits for you and the baby. So that's the first thing, is continue to work on small changes with your patients and empower them. Now, some practical tips of living with in pregnancy and use of CGM. So when we're thinking about what affects blood sugars, right, we're thinking about our activity, our food, and our insulin. Typically, medications is insulin in pregnancy. And so, how can we use CGM to optimize those things? Well, my nutritionists always say to my patients in pregnancy, anytime you have a carb, make sure you have protein, right? Because the protein mitigates that effect of the rise of the blood sugar. Additionally, we always talk about high fiber. So, the quick and dirty is 3 grams of fiber per serving of carbohydrate, and you're going to have less rise in blood sugar. So you can talk all you want at your patients and tell them that, but with the continuous glucose monitoring device, they see what happens, right? They see when they have a half a cup of white rice that has 0.1 gram of fiber in it, versus maybe then they chose a whole wheat couscous that has 3 grams of fiber. And you can see that they don't have as much of rise in blood sugar. So it helps them make those good decisions. Additionally, we did have a rise in blood sugar. Well, what can we do to mitigate that outside of insulin after it's occurring? Well, walking after the meal will definitely decrease the blood sugar. And there was actually a great continuous glucose monitoring study where they looked at if you walk for 15 minutes after the meal or you walk for 30 minutes once a day, who had better blood sugar control. Now, this wasn't in the pregnant population, but they did see that there was better control if you walked for 15 minutes after each meal. And so, what a great motivator. And also, most people can find 5 to 10 to 15 minutes during the day after a meal to do this, versus some people find it's overwhelming to block off that 30-minute to hour walking exercise. So again, and then you get the positive reinforcement from your continuous glucose monitor as you see the natural decline in your blood sugar from exercise. And then the final thing is that, during pregnancy, every week you're a little more pregnant, right? And every week, unfortunately, we tend to be a little bit more insulin resistant. So our CGM gives us more immediate feedback of those changes that are happening during the course of the pregnancy. And then as well, the physiology of pregnancy is sometimes we need to time our insulin earlier. So the traditional teaching is 15 minutes before the meal to match that food onset. But that works well, okay, for the first trimester, but in the second trimester, it's 30 minutes. And in the third trimester, it's up to 45 minutes. And again, you have your continuous glucose monitor to give you feedback on how effective your insulin dosing is doing and if you're matching the peak of the food onset.
It's pretty amazing, Nicole, as you're talking about it. It strikes me that feedback loop is incredibly important. And it's important not just for seeing what your glucose rise is after different types of foods, which you made clear and we know is important, but even for things like activity, where it can be this wonderful positive feedback loop for the type of exercise that we often recommend, but people aren't always committed to. And again, even for timing of when you take your medicines, a lot of benefits there.
Yes, I agree. And that's why I'm a big advocate for it. And I think this is where we need to highlight that, unfortunately, the technology is not available across the spectrum. And in pregnancy, what I've seen is that in some social economic standpoints, they'll buy their own CGM to sort of help them during the pregnancy, since it's not approved for use in pregnancy yet. But that might not be available for someone who's living on a more fixed income, and the cost is just prohibitive to them. So that's why we need to continue to advocate for this technology.
That's a really good point. So I think there's a lot of benefit that it's very clear will accrue to our patients by use of CGM, by thinking about it during that preconception phase. Any final thoughts you have for our listeners?
Yeah, thank you for that. So, this isn't a pregnancy and diabetes case, but it just hit me very strongly I was working with one of our primary care provider community partners last week, and we were talking about a case where the A1Cs were running in the sixes, so looked very good, but they happened to notice the person had splenomegaly and random blood sugars that they checked were in the 200s plus. So this patient wasn't insured, so they used a sample of a continuous glucose monitoring over the course of 2 weeks, and they found his average blood sugars were 260. So again, we were able to show that he had uncontrolled diabetes. And so the next step we were talking about is, well, what medication management? But what the primary care provider told me was that, well, if you look at the last 3 days of that 14 weeks, his actually average blood sugars was back down in the 150s because he saw what was happening and modified his diet and activity. And so to me, that was like just an amazing, powerful picture of what the power of CGM is going to do, because I was like, I was talking about insulin. And then when I heard that, I was like, oh, maybe we can just let him watch for a little bit longer and continue those good lifestyles and then decide the right step for his medication management if needed. And so this is very similar to diabetes and pregnancy, right? The goal is not to have to start insulin, is not to have to increase your cumulative insulin dose despite your increased insulin resistance. And so this is just a tool of empowerment for our patients living with diabetes and diabetes and pregnancy.
Nicole, I love that. The power lies within. One of our goals as clinicians is to try and help the patient bring out the power that they don't realize that they have. This was fantastic. And thanks so much for joining us and sharing your expertise, both on the data, but even more importantly, just that sense of how this works and how important it can be for patients, and to use your word, how empowering it can be for them. Nicole, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
For more information on time and range, please go to the American Diabetes Association's 2022 Standards of Care, and additional resources are available at professional.diabetes.org/time and range. For the American Diabetes Association, I'm Dr. Neil Skolnick. Until next time, stay safe and keep learning.